He looked ahead once more, focusing on young Plautus. Young? The lad was probably the same age as him, in truth, but his eagerness for this dismal supply depot duty made him seem so much younger. What? Do we hire 4 new men, sir, or do we wait for instructions from command? The man repeated with exaggerated patience. Vincentius huffed and blew angrily into his hands again. It had both surprised and irritated him when he'd been given this command that he'd had no Roman troops assigned to him. Legionaries would pass through regularly, of course, with the supply wagons, but his grand command had consisted of 4 surly, ill-spoken, hairy, stinking locals who resented his very existence. They had been paid monthly, more than Vincentius thought they could ever be worth, but apparently they were Aedui tribesmen, and therefore the commanders seemed to think they needed to be looked after. At least they spoke Latin, even if only as well as a 3-year-old. But then, 2 days ago, the 4 men had gone off duty, leaving the 2 Roman officers alone and rather defenceless in the depot, and had gone to carouse in Desetio across the hill, and they'd not come back. Personally, Vincentius couldn't care less what happened to them, but for 2 reasons. Firstly, a huge caravan was due in Massilia heading north to the winter quarters of the legions, which would require a full complement of workers. And secondly, while he hated the locals and trusted them about as far as he could kick the goat, it felt a lot less safe with only Plautus keeping him company. Take the coins from the pay chest and head into Desetio. There'll be a few likely lads that will jump at the chance of steady payment to ride out the winter. See if you can cut the pay offer and still get strong men, though, Plautus. Might as well skim a few coins from the top and make this awful place worthwhile. As the young cavalryman saluted and wandered off about his business, Vincentius pulled his cloak, an item of apparel that made about as much difference as a gossamer tunic in this weather, tight around him, and scurried off back to his hovel. As he approached, he noted with some relief that at least his adjutant had got a fire going while he'd been out for a shit and a wash. A grey column drifted up from the smoke hole in the centre of the roof. With immense gratitude, Vincentius pushed open the door of his accommodation, pausing just inside for a moment to let his eyes adjust as the door clunked shut behind him. The difference in comfort of the interior's fire-lit warmth, even if it did still smell of the goat which had clearly lived here before him, was palpable, and he dropped the ice-cold cloak onto the chest near the door and strode over towards the small central hearth, rubbing his hands and anticipating the warm orange glow. He barely noticed the movement in the periphery of his vision, but some sense made him look up, away from the fire, the light still dancing wild in his retinas, just as the figures emerged from the shadows at the edge of the room. 3 thoughts ran through his mind in quick succession. Where is my sword? Are these my missing workers? Where is Plautus? The answers were clear and not encouraging. His sword was by his bed at the far side of the room, along with anything else of use. There were more than 4 men here, and they did not have the same churlish air that he'd come to recognize from his Aedui workers, radiating more menace than irritation. And Plautus would be somewhere out in the compound, going about the endless tasks that kept him busy. He tried to shout out in alarm, but a huge hand clamped across his mouth and stifled the noise. How many figures there were he couldn't tell, but he could see 6 before him, and felt the presence of more behind. They moved like hunting cats, with grace and silence, so eerily, in fact, that he wondered for a moment if they were Lemures, the restless dead, come to claim a living victim. But these were no spirits, for all the terror with which they filled him. Each wore a dark wool cloak that had blended with the shadows at the room's edge, rendering them almost invisible, and beneath the hoods, as they looked upon the Roman commander, emotionless, staring, cold faces peered out. Identical ones, too. Masks, he realized.